Welcome to the Speak Like a Leader podcast with John Bates. Welcome to the show. With me today, I have a guy who is not only a big figure in my life, he's just a big figure. He's someone I met years and years ago, and we have become good friends. He is someone who made an enormous difference for me, and I think he's got some perspectives and some things to offer to you that will make a big difference for you. With me today is Mark Lovett, and Mark was the organizer of TEDxSanDiego for 6 years. Over those 6 years, he worked on more than 20 events. He is now living in Lisbon, working as a speaker coach with a focus on storytelling. You can find him at storytellingwithimpact.com. That's storytellingwithimpact.com. And on LinkedIn, he's linkedin.com/in/Mark Lovett, MarkLovett. So, Mark, I am so thrilled that you're with me today. Welcome.
John, it's always exciting to connect with you, and it's an honor to be here on your podcast.
Well, thank you. So, you've got, I think that it would be fair to say that many people still really want to give that TED talk, their TEDx talk, their TED talk, whatever it is. And you've got a lot of behind the scenes. So I want to start out by asking you a little bit about that. And then we'll talk about the power of storytelling and all kinds of other stuff. But, you have a lot of experience as a TEDx organizer, and you are the person that a lot of people would love to talk to about giving their TED-like talk, their TEDx talk. Let's just start with that. Like, how do TEDx organizers go about finding speakers for their events?
So the first thing that I tell people who want to be on a TEDx stage is, first and foremost, follow your passion. Whatever the topic is that you want to speak about, this should be something that you're involved with on a daily basis. And you should be speaking in other venues about this topic, whether it's overcoming adversity, whether it's leadership, a new way to revolutionize the education system, whatever your topic happens to be, you should be writing about it and speaking about it. Because one of the ways that organizers find speakers is through searching. And when you come up in a Google search as an expert on a certain topic, you're a subject matter expert, you're a thought leader, that will really catch the attention of an organizer. They'll say, let me dig into this person. Let me find out what they're doing. What's their history? What's their background? That sort of thing.
Well, Mark, it sounds like the what I tell people sometimes, and what I try to do myself is go live a TED-worthy life. Like, the worst that could happen is that you don't speak at TED and you have a fabulous life making an unbelievable difference, right? And that's the way that you're going to get, I think, on a TED stage too, is to go, like you said, follow your passion and live a life that's TED-worthy.
That's exactly it. Because every person who's been on my stage is someone who I've investigated, I've looked into. I've basically looked at their CV, whether it's on paper, whether it's on the internet, if they have their own website, whether it's through searching. Have they written articles for magazines? Are they a professor at a college? What gave them this level of expertise that they want to speak about? So that I want to know that somebody who's on stage has lived that experience, and they're going to be speaking from their own experience, not just quoting other people, but talking about their journey of how they discovered this very important thing that they now want to share with the world. And you only do that, as you say, through living that life, through living that TED-worthy life. So that's a good point.
The other thing, Mark, that I tell people, and I'd love your take on this, is that, I think a lot of people don't fully know that, even though the names are kind of give it away, that TEDx events are are geographically based, right? You organize TEDxSanDiego. There's TEDx, there's TEDx, all kinds of things, but they're all organized around the geography. So they're a location based event. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that TEDx organizers want to get people in their community up on stage. So people who have some tie to San Diego, you might bring somebody in from outside if they had a big name or they fit the thing you were trying to do. But most of the people on that stage at TEDxSanDiego are from the area. And even more, what I think people don't fully understand is that there are such amazing people in the TEDx community that you're definitely going to be further down the priority list if you're not coming to TEDx's and mingling, and if you're not a known member of the TEDx community from that locale. Is that fair to say?
I'll go back to your first point when you talked about TEDx as being location-based. And the other aspect of that is that every single TEDx is independently organized.
Yes.
The TEDx's have to conform to a set of rules that come out of TED in New York City. Mm-hmm. But other than conforming to those rules, you're left on your own to create your own event and make it happen. So that means, I know pre-pandemic, there were over 3,000 TEDx events happening around the globe, about an average of 9 to 10 of them a day. And they're all organized based on the vision of a single person, because only a single person can hold the license to an event.
Yeah.
So every organizer I've spoken with, and I've interacted with hundreds of them from all over the world, they have their own little take on how they find speakers, what they want their stage to look like. I've talked to organizers who only use local speakers. They never go outside their geography, if you will. And other organizers that have the money to do so, they will search the globe and they will fly people halfway around the world. I had a funny story of a gentleman that I knew in San Diego, and in the back of my mind, I said, one day I'm going to put him on my stage when it feels right, when I think his topic is ready to be presented. And before that happened, I got an email from an organizer in France that said, "Hey, Mark, one of my speakers says he knows you." Well, this organizer in France had found this guy through an article that was published about the work he was doing, called him up and said, "I want you to speak here." And they flew him halfway around the world to speak. So that goes back to that following your passion and living a TED-worthy life. You never know who might contact you from where. And then to touch on your following point, to be connected to the TED organization, or the TEDx organization, I should say, in your town, is a great way for you to understand how that TEDx operates, the kinds of people they're looking for. When I got into organizing, I started going to TEDx events all over the place.
So, for the recording, I think maybe we're still getting you, Mark, but I'm having a little bit of a hard time. You're sounding a little chopped out and robotic for me. I think it's an internet storm.
Okay. And I know you can edit all this stuff out.
I typically don't, but if I need to, I can chop that out. Will you just kind of recap what you just said in case we missed it?
Sure. This is actually asking me to reconnect. Should I reconnect, or is that not a good idea?
No, I think you can go ahead and stay there. Yeah.
Okay.
Now that I hear you, okay.
Okay. So it is interesting that all of the TEDx events around the world are independently organized. And that means each organizer determines what his event's going to look like. And that means they determine what kind of speakers are going to be on their stage.
Yeah.
And so there are organizers who only want to find speakers from their local geographic area. And there are other organizers who will search the entire globe looking for just the right person to put on their stage. Now, that means they have the budget to fly somebody across country or halfway around the world to be a speaker there. But there are many cases. One example is somebody that I knew in San Diego who I planned to have on my stage. And before that happened, I got an email from an organizer in France telling me that they had selected him already. And they said, hey, Mark, it's kind of funny that one of our speakers says he knows you. So this guy with a great idea, somebody else in another country actually grabbed him. And it was because he was living that TED-worthy life. And he got into a publication with the work he was doing, and somebody else found him.
That's cool. So, and, these are all volunteer. This is a volunteer deal, right? To be a TEDx organizer, it's not like you can make lots of money on a TEDx event. That's
correct. That's the nature of TEDx organizations, is that they are nonprofit and they're all volunteer. So I would put in 1,000 hours a year and not get paid a dime. My entire team were all volunteers. During our big events, which had 1,800 people attend, we had about 120 volunteers, all the way from parking guides to ushers and people working the lobby, people working backstage in the green room. A lot of people are required in order to put on some of these big TEDx events.
Yeah. So I imagine, I'm being facetious. I actually know that prima donna speakers don't do very well in the TEDx world. Is that right?
There are people who want to be on a TEDx stage simply to brag about it or put it on their resume. They're a famous speaker. They think they deserve to be on a stage.
Yeah.
And in those cases, the biggest problem is they're not coachable.
Yeah.
And part of the process of putting on a TEDx is that all of the speakers are coached in order to bring out the most powerful story possible.
Yes.
So prima donna speakers are usually avoided by most organizers because they're difficult to deal with, and they might give a good talk, but they rarely give the best talk.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it, Mark? Because that's so true. The speaker that sort of takes it for granted, that thinks they're already really great and all that, that's never the best speaker. It's always one of the people who's a little bit more, maybe not as famous, maybe hasn't done speaking as much, but who's ultra coachable and then just gives that talk that blows the whole audience away. That's how it goes. I definitely agree. And I think that's one of the great things about the TEDx experience for speakers is that there's some great coaching you're going to get at almost any TEDx event. I mean, even just having somebody who's watched a number of these speeches in their lifetime look at your speech from, it's hard to see the picture when you're in the frame, right? And I think most TEDx events that I know of, there's some feedback loops built in there to help make those talks really good.
You're correct. The coaching process is really key, and the people who really want to learn and want to dig into their story and are very humble about it, those oftentimes they'll give the best talk. And I've had people that I've approached who looked at me kind of mystified, and they said, I've never even imagined being on a TEDx stage, never been a goal of mine. But as it turns out, they are very passionate about their topic, about their idea that they want to tell the world. And so those are the folks that tend to connect to the audience in the most real fashion also, because they come on stage and they're just like somebody who you would meet, walking down the street, but they just have a great idea. They're not a professional speaker. They're just somebody who wants to share an idea that they have.
Yeah, it's fabulous. I wonder, Mark, what do you think out of your experience are some of the key elements of what I'm calling the TED format or a TED-like talk, which is obviously what we're going for at TEDx, but it's something that almost all, it's like every event that I know of now is asking, they're saying to their speakers, well, we want you to give a TED-like talk, So what do you think are the elements of that? What are some of the key things that you focus on with people around that?
So one of the phrases I start with is, the audience should see the world differently after hearing your talk.
That's great.
And so I want a speaker to be able to explain to me what that means for them.
Yeah.
In other words, the audience walks in and they sit down and here's what they think about that topic. And now after your 15 minutes on stage, now what are they thinking? Did they learn something? Were their perspectives challenged? Was their horizon expanded? How are they different coming out? Because once you think differently, then you can act differently. Then you see the world differently. And so people who come to me that have a great idea, I know the 10 secrets to leadership. And then what they tell me are 10 things that everybody on the planet already knows. They may really believe in those 10 things, but nobody in the audience is going to walk away changed.
Yeah.
And so even on a topic as common as that, as something like leadership, the question becomes, what's unique about you? What's unique about your idea? How do you see things differently than everybody else? So that someone in the audience is going to say to themselves, wow, I never thought of it that way. I didn't see it quite like that. This guy is really, or this gal has really changed my opinion on this subject.
Yeah.
So that's where I always start with people.
That's fabulous. That's fabulous. And, one of the other big pieces of coaching that I got from TED when I spoke, and, you were probably there, Mark, when I blew my first ever chance there at TED Active. I was on the stage and I made the mistake that we were talking about a little bit and could talk about more. I did it for myself, admittedly, and I didn't realize it. And it's not, but boy, I was up there to try to impress people and to try to establish my industry authority. And I made all the mistakes, Mark, and I wrote an article in Inc. about it. And you can find it if you search John Bates TED fail. But one of the things that subsequently I got coached in was, what's your one idea worth spreading? Which, that really makes people do a double take. And, but I think that's one of the core components of the TED format too, right? Is what's your singular idea? And then everything else has to line up behind that.
Exactly. And when I ask people what their idea is, I let them say whatever they want to say. And sometimes their idea is singular and it is very focused and it's just spot on. Other times my initial feedback is, hey, Kay, that's wonderful. I just heard 4 stories from you.
Yes.
Which is great because you have 4 speeches to give in other parts of the world or on other stages or whatever that might be. That's cool. But for this one talk that's coming up, which of these 4 ideas is the one that you want to work on?
Yeah.
And I recall a speaker who was on our stage who went through that. And there are times when I would coach my speakers at TEDx, but I also had a team of half a dozen local coaches that I could use to help, because that's a lot of work to coach a dozen speakers. And I got a first draft from this one speaker, and there were 5 ideas in this. And I said, wow, this is really cool. This guy's got a lot to say. What's the one idea that he's going to talk about? And I kept pushing down that path. And unfortunately, when he came on stage, he gave a talk that had 5 different ideas. And the audience ended up going, wow, we really like that guy, but we have no idea what he was talking about.
Yeah.
So that was the downside of trying to push too many topics into one single talk. If you're going to do a TEDx style talk, have this one point, which is what you were talking about.
Yeah. I got taught, of course, I didn't listen when I did that first talk myself that I blew so badly, but I was taught when you cram your information in, you cram your audience out, which is pretty darn good advice from Craig Valentine. And, that's definitely what I have seen too in the unsuccessful or maybe less successful TED Talks that I've seen like that. So I think those are great things. What's another aspect for you, Mark?
So another aspect is to know yourself and know your material. And by that, I mean, that you really have to know what your talk is going to be about. And this is a process that you really have to work at. And this is writing and rewriting and editing and really digging layers down below the surface to really come up with the best narrative you can. Now, some people are able to memorize a 15-minute TEDx style talk. And when I work
usually they have a lot of time if they're going to make that work.
Yeah. And we would start coaching people 4 or 5 months before the event.
Yes.
And we would tell people that how good you are is going to depend on how hard you work.
Yeah.
And so some people would rehearse 50, 60, 70 times, and they would get their body language down. Yeah. We always call this process getting a talk to move from your head down to your heart.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it.
So if you think about singing Happy Birthday, how often do you have to think about the lyrics?
Yeah, not at all.
It just comes out of you because you know it. So if you know it that well, you can memorize the talk and be very natural on stage. It doesn't seem like you're reciting a talk. You're actually living it while you're speaking. But some people, that is not the way they operate. Their brain just doesn't memorize that way. So in that case, once the talk is done, then we take an entire manuscript and then we extract an outline of that talk.
Yeah.
And then we're able to say, here's the 6, 7, 8, 9 points that you're going to make. And here's the order that they need to be in. Because just like a good book or a good movie, stories unfold in a specific fashion. And if you know what those items are and you know what order they come in, I've worked with clients who rehearse, and every single time they rehearse, it's a little bit different. But the essence of the story is the same.
Yeah.
They forget a sentence here, they add a sentence there, they use different words, and that's all fine. But you have to at least work hard enough to know what your story's about.
Yeah. You know, Mark, for me, rarely do I have people that sound as good when they memorize it. And one of the fears I have about memorizing talks word for word, unless you've got 5, 6 months to practice it, is that if they're memorized word for word, they sometimes come across sounding a little bit insincere because it sounds like a well-written talk, but it's well-written. And the other problem about memorizing word for word, if you don't have just a lot of time, is I call it the alphabet song, like sing the alphabet song starting at J, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, right? Like you have to go all the way back because it's all stuck together like one thing. And so the method that I usually use with people, unless they really want to memorize, and some people do, and that works, but, is that idea of doing it over and over from an outline. And what I find is it tends to start to be this, it's almost word for word, but it's not stuck together like one thing. Like once somebody does it from an outline 5 or 10 times, they're going to do it pretty much the same way every time, but it won't be that precisely word for word. And I find that really helps people, avoid sounding a little robotic. And it also helps them, if they have any kind of an issue, they don't have to go back an entire phrase or back, to catch up with where they might have forgotten what they were going to say. Right.
Exactly. And that's why I say to not only know your material, but know yourself. And
yes.
Don't try to be somebody else.
Yeah.
Don't try to be that guy who memorizes and is 100% natural if that's not how you operate. And if you don't have the time to actually memorize it. Yeah. So don't force yourself into being something you're not. And when you're rehearsing, and I encourage people to rehearse in front of friends and family, it's really great if you have a buddy who you can rehearse in front of repeatedly and who can give you feedback on things that are confusing or if they lost their way at some point so that you can revise your text. But that person can tell you that talk is still up in your head. You're kind of like a robot. You mentioned the alphabet. You're delivering it as though you're reading it, and it doesn't sound natural. Yeah. And you want that feedback early on. Ideally, you want somebody telling you that a month ahead of time so that you can then alter your plan. and say,
Yes.
okay, I don't need to memorize word for word. That's too hard for me, but I do want to be sure I tell the whole story.
Right.
And so then it just becomes a matter of rehearsing enough times. You will know that story. In fact, if you think about your own life, most people have a story that they've told 100 times.
Yeah.
The time they went on the best vacation of their life, or maybe
Yeah.
it's the time they crashed their car.
Yeah.
And they've told that story to so many people, you could walk up to them on the street and say, oh, tell me that story about when you went to Paris. And they'll immediately tell you that story. And that's
Yes.
because they've told it so many times. So that rehearsal process really gets you familiar with the words and you start owning them. And it doesn't really matter if it's word for word. It's really
Yeah.
the story that counts.
Yes. Well, and a lot of times people will say, but John, if I practice, I'm going to look like I rehearsed and I'm going to look all stiff. And, I remind people that Steve Jobs, after they created the speech, which takes long enough already, he would practice it for an hour for every minute he was going to be on stage. And, there is this place where you can practice so much that it looks like you practiced a lot, and that's not the goal. But then there's this other place where you can practice so much that it looks like you didn't practice at all. And that is the goal. And that just takes way more practice.
Yes. One of the analogies I use is if you think about some of these famous musicians,
Yeah.
when I think about that, I'm going back to old rock groups, it's Doobie Brothers or something like that.
Uh-huh.
And these people have toured the world 100 times, and their hit songs, everybody wants to hear them. And if they come out and play that song and they look like they're bored, they're going to get booed off the stage.
Yes.
And you ask these musicians, how is it that you keep this energy up for a song that you've played 1,000 times? And they go, we just love this song. We love the fact that people love this song. We want to give them every bit of us in this song every single time we play it.
Yes.
And so it's that focus on the audience that we talked about earlier. If you're there on stage to deliver that message to the audience, that passion will come out of you.
Yes.
Because this also applies to people who are what I call on the circuit. People who will craft a talk and then they'll deliver it 40 or 50 times all over the world.
Yeah.
They have to be fresh every time. They have to engage that audience every time. They have to live it every time, not just recite it, but live it.
Absolutely. I mean, I like to remember that it's the first time they've heard it.
Yes.
Might not be the first time I've said it, but this is the first time I've said it to them. Right. And we're all here right now, That's
exactly it. Because when you walk out on that stage, that audience looks at you and 99% of them probably don't even know who you are, or they've heard something about you, but they definitely haven't heard this exact talk. Exactly. And what that little voice in their head is saying, I wonder what he's going to tell us today.
Yeah.
They're eager. They want to hear your wisdom. They want to hear your story, and they want to have it delivered to them, with that passion and that energy so that they believe it.
Yeah. Well, and you brought up another thing, which reminds me of the TED commandments, which I wasn't aware of at first. I wish I would have had those the first time I spoke. I might not have blown it so badly, but I actually did a series of videos breaking down the TED commandments. And, one of those relates to what you just talked about, the speakers that are out there on that are on tour, that are going around, that are doing that same speech 40, 50 times. Well, one of the TED commandments is thou shalt not trot out thy usual shtick. So that's another place that really famous speakers kind of get in trouble with TEDx is, it's not an opportunity to go give that speech for the 51st time. It's an opportunity to step back and think about what it's like to be the person that gives that speech all over the world, or what's the deeper insight you got now that you've done this for so long, but to do something that's not your usual shtick, right?
Yes, we always talk to speakers about their area of expertise. and we push them into an area that's new for them to say, what is it that you haven't talked about before? Or how can you express this differently than what you have before?
Yeah.
Because I've been to a lot of TEDx events, and occasionally someone will come out on stage, and as soon as they start talking, I just do one of those, face plants, and I think, oh no, they're doing their corporate shtick.
Yeah.
They're doing
that's
the
so
talk that
embarrassing.
delivered, and you can hear it because the delivery is different, and the style of it is different, and you know that they've given it over and over and over again. And sadly, whoever that organizer was didn't take the time and work with them to come up with something new.
Yeah. Boy, it reminds me of another experience that I always tell this to my speakers, but love to hear your take on this, Mark. But I think that people walk off the TEDx stage or the TED stage, and there's no middle ground about how they feel. Either they walk off the stage going, "Oh, dang, I wish I would have practiced more. Crap. Oh, that wasn't as good as I wanted it to be." And that is a devastating, awful, super low, terrible way to feel. Or they walk off the stage just elated because they gave it everything it deserved. They practiced, they worked on it. They knew, they did it till they knew they could deliver it the way they wanted to deliver it. And then they went out there, and that energy of TEDx pulls you one way or the other, right? Like when someone walks out on stage and they're not quite ready and it's not going to go so well, it goes really badly, and it's still a loving audience, but gosh, it feels terrible. When they walk out and they're ready, that TEDx energy and excitement just lifts them up even higher than they ever imagined they could go. And it's a fabulous experience. And I know I like one of those feelings much better than the other.
Yes, it is a very different feeling if you're on stage trying your hardest to deliver, and all of that energy is just going out of you.
Yeah.
And that's very different than when there's an interplay. And I'll tell speakers, using the word love can be controversial because people think of it in different ways. But when I tell speakers, you get out there, you're going to feel the love from the audience.
Yes.
And some of them look at me kind of quizzical, like, what are you talking about? I said, you just watch, and you can feel the audience. Some of it's through laughter, some of it's through applause, but you can just see it in their eyes. You can see this energy. If you're standing in front of 1,000 people, the energy of 1,000 people comes up on stage.
Oh.
And if you're prepared, you're in receivership of that energy. Yeah. Whereas if you're not prepared, you're only inside your own head thinking, oh my God, I didn't rehearse this enough. Where do I go to next? I forgot my next line. I don't know where I'm going. And you're struggling through it. Yeah. And you never get that advantage.
That's right. I mean, and it's just such a different experience, and it does get kind of pulled to one extreme or the other. There's not a whole lot of walking off the stage feeling,
Yeah, exactly. And you can see when people come off stage, whether they have this look like they've been through a traumatic experience, or whether they have this smile on their face. Yeah. And even if they know they weren't the best speaker on the planet, they know that they were prepared and they had fun doing it, and it was an enjoyable experience.
And people connected with them. And
it's a big difference.
Yeah. It's fabulous. I mean, I will say it's just, one of the things that I don't know that people understand when they're sitting just in the TEDx audience is how much time the really good TEDx events spend with their speakers and how much of a performance that is. And, a lot of times the speakers will know each other too, like a lot of the TEDx events that I've supported will start with group speaker coaching. And so you get kind of an ensemble effect because everybody sees how great everybody else's speeches are, and it sort of lifts the whole thing up, and everybody wants to be as good as each other and make sure this whole thing's going to be fabulous. And it's people know that happens because they experience how wonderful it is to be in the audience, but I don't think they consciously know what all that takes, you know?
You're right. One of the events we put on was at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies.
Uh-huh.
And we had 11 speakers on stage. I think 8 of them had PhDs, so they were way smarter than me. And in that case, I ended up coaching all the 11 speakers because I wanted to be sure that the science didn't overlap too much. I wanted to be sure that all these different technologies stood on their own. And I met with each one of those speakers 10 times. And each of those meetings was an hour long where we would go through their talk and they would have homework at the end of it. And I would come back 3, 4, 5 days later. We'd go through another hour, and then a week would go by and we'd do another hour.
Yep.
And they would give me this feedback along the lines of, I've never worked so hard. I can't believe there's this much to do. Yeah. And I can't remember who said the famous quote that was 90% of writing is rewriting.
Yeah.
And it's not until you put it down on paper and then you say it and you realize, oh, no, that's not what I mean. Okay, that's fine. Go back and add that missing paragraph. Cut out that sentence that doesn't make sense. Change the words around. Now come back and do it again.
Yes.
And what I often tell people, too, is that creating a good talk is a journey of self-exploration.
For sure.
You will learn so much about yourself if you put the time into it, because as you peel back those layers and you dig deeper and you start asking yourself, well, why did this happen? And why did I feel that way? I've been with so many speakers that had these aha moments that suddenly understood their childhood. They suddenly understood their boss. They understood their spouse. They understood why something worked or why something didn't work.
Yeah.
Because their whole life they had stayed at one level and they thought that was the story.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until they kept asking questions, this why and why and why, that a whole new type of story would present itself. And those people, when they get on stage, they will tell stories that, I'm thinking of a couple of cases that brought the audience to tears.
Tears, yes.
Because they took them to such a personal place that 3 or 4 months prior, they would have never shared the story in that fashion. But they put in the work to make it happen.
And Mark, it brings up for me what I've come to believe over the past decade of doing this, which is that so first of all, there's this thing that we call the TED format, right? And it's a little bit different for everybody. I think the TED Commandments is a great kind of, guardrail for what the TED format is. I think that it's become obvious that there's, everybody's got their own take, but there is something there. And I think TED gets credit for repopularizing what I'm now thinking of as just basically the original format. The TED format is really originally what works with human beings. And you're there in Lisbon near that place where they just found the 4,000 person amphitheater underground, right? That had been covered up and forgotten. And, I love what you said. You said the Romans were doing TEDx's here for, a couple thousand years ago, right? And that's really cool. And I think that's really true. And I think that this format, there's something about this format that is just, it forces people to go on what I think is the most important leadership journey that you could possibly go on, to just figure out how to express yourself in this one idea very succinctly, very clearly, with great rhetoric and thought. And that's just an exercise that's worth doing, whether you ever get on a TED stage or not, I think.
So I always go back to my buddy Aristotle.
Yeah.
People can't
you used to hang out with him, right?
Yeah, we are. We are old drinking buddies. I am that old. But he talked about these principles of the emotional side of storytelling, the intellectual side, and then the authenticity that comes from being someone who speaks of what they know, not using somebody else's words. Now, he mainly studied politicians and attorneys because back in the Greek days, that's who was doing that kind of oration. The average person on the street wasn't giving talks. But those principles still hold till today. And so when you can give a talk that makes logical sense, but also comes from the heart and touch people emotionally, and if people know that you have lived this story that you're talking about, you have this opportunity to connect with an audience. And I'll always say that storytelling is so fundamental that it's how we came to understand our humanity and express our humanity. Go back to your very earliest days. You're 2 days old, and you're learning about the world through listening to stories. Every person around you is telling you a story. Now, a lot of it is, aren't you so cute and you're wonderful and all this stuff. But little by little, they start teaching you what is a table and what is a chair, and they explain things to you before you can even speak a single word. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, you start to be able to speak. And by the time you're 2 or 3 years old, you have become a storyteller. In fact, by the time you're 5 years old, you're probably talking so much your parents wish you would shut up once in a while. But this is so fundamental that by the time we're 5 years old, our entire world is based in stories. And sometimes people forget that. And they think that storytelling is some profession that only these polished professionals can do. I said, think about the last time you were sitting around the dinner table, or you met some friends for lunch or in a bar. What happened? And what they invariably tell me is, oh, everybody sat around telling each other stories. So the beauty of getting up on a stage is that you have an opportunity to tell a well thought out story, a structured story, a story where you've really paid attention to what you want to say, rather than just sitting at the dinner table rambling about something incoherently almost, and everybody's, stepping on each other and talking over each other and that sort of thing. You get out on a stage with an audience and they're quiet and they're listening to you. That's a beautiful opportunity. But always remember that you've been a storyteller your whole life.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I tell people you've got the genetic capability to do this, or your ancestors would have been plucked out of the gene pool a long time ago.
Exactly right.
It's built in. It's part of being human. And I think you're right. Hollywood tries to bamboozle us that they're the only ones that know how to tell stories right. No, it's human.
Yeah. And I love meeting some 7 or 8 year old girl who is passionate about something, and they will just start speaking extemporaneously, and you're just blown away. Yeah. In their case, their mind goes into story mode, and they can tell you the story about when they were at their lemonade stand and the people who came by and what happened. Yeah. And it's a beautiful thing. Sometimes we lose sight of that and we disconnect from it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think we overthink it, and get all caught up in, our reputation and what are people going to think, and I need to be perfect, and none of that really matters.
Yeah, it's a very unique skill, as I said, because all of us have been doing it our entire life. Whereas if you want to be good at violin, you haven't touched a violin until you're maybe 7 or 8 years old, and then you got to play it for 20 years to really be good. You want to be a brain surgeon, you got to go through a lot of years of school to get to that point. But storytelling, like I said, you do it all day long, every single day.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, it's a big part of being human. And it brings up another aspect for me, Mark, because you and I both have the power of storytelling in common. It's one of the things we think is really, really important. Sometimes in the corporate world or the science world, where I tend to spend a lot of time, I get some pushback. People are like, oh, what are you talking about? Once upon a time and happily ever after. What do you mean storytelling? Right. What do you say to those people, Mark?
I tell them that we're not here to write a fictional story. This is not Hollywood. This is not Brad Pitt and some actress who are going to just create this fantasy world. If you're in business or you're a scientist, this is about the real world. But the point is, I want to understand what your message means to real people.
Yeah.
So when a scientist tells me, here's how many parts per million of CO2 are in the atmosphere, and we're on an upward trajectory of X, and by the year 2030, we're going to be at this level, and that means more ice is going to melt, and all this kind of stuff. That's wonderful. I love scientific stuff. But that doesn't mean anything to the average person.
Right. Well, that's one of the problems with communicating about this.
Right. But it's very different if you show a picture of a woman standing on top of her house during Hurricane Katrina, where the water has come up to the roof line, and she is praying that a helicopter or a boat comes by so that she doesn't drown and die.
Right.
And now people can connect CO2, greenhouse gas, warmer atmosphere, ice is melting, sea levels rising, storms are becoming more powerful.
Yeah.
So in that case, the story is not something made up. The story is real, but it's connected to the scientific data.
Yeah.
But those stories don't become part of most corporate reports or most papers that get published by scientists, which is fine because those are their own purpose. You're reporting on quarterly growth or you're reporting on this latest finding out of your laboratory. But when you want to go speak to the public, the public needs to know, how does that relate to me? And how does that relate to humanity? And what is the effect of this thing that you're telling me? That's why politicians so easily, they actually swing the other way. They refuse to tell anybody what's actually going on. They just say, more jobs, lower taxes, vote for me. Yeah. And the public doesn't say, well, can you prove that? And because 99% of the time they cannot prove that. Yeah. But to give a good talk, like a TEDx talk, to be able to present the data and wrap it in stories in this genre that's often called narrative nonfiction, is where you're taking this nonfiction material, but you're delivering it in a narrative format as though it were, a good book, a novel, that sort of thing. Yeah. And it's an art and a science and requires work to do that so that it is competent, but it does get the point across.
Yeah. I mean, and in leadership roles too, I think that it's really important. One of the things that just hit me recently is that if you're a leader and you can't communicate your stories, and you're not a good storyteller, then the value of all of your experience is vastly diminished because the value of your experience is only valuable to you if you can't put it into a good story. But if you can wrap that experience into a good, and I think your point is well taken, nonfiction story. It's a nonfiction story. We're not saying make this up. We're saying tell us your experience and tell us the lesson and the point of this experience. And now your experience becomes highly leverageable across your entire organization potentially versus just being locked in your head because you can't tell a good story about it, right?
You mentioned Steve Jobs earlier.
Yes.
And when I'm speaking to entrepreneurs and marketing folks, I usually have to show a picture of this because I'm dating myself. It goes back so far. But I remember when the first iPod came out, and that was a device that looks like an iPhone, but it just was for playing music.
It's funny that we have to explain what an iPod was.
Because now it's built into your phone.
Yeah.
But I think it was one of the first ads, just very simply said, 1,000 songs in your pocket. And that was the most amazing storytelling for two reasons. One is because it explained exactly what the device did. It didn't give you any specifications or how much memory or how fast the processor was. It told you what this will mean to you. And what all the consumers did was say, you've got to be kidding. I can go jogging and hear music. I can hear music while I'm driving. I can hear music while I'm gardening. I can hear music while I'm So everyone created their own story around this capability. And oftentimes that's where we need to go with science and other kinds of business stories, is that people will extend the story that you're telling them to include themselves and figure out, what does that mean to me? How is my life going to be different?
Yes. Well, and it's such a great example, Mark, that you make there, because that, there's no once upon a time, there's no happily ever after. It's basically a sentence, right? It's only a few words, 1,000 songs in your pocket. That counts. That's storytelling. And that's actually incredibly powerful, vivid, excellent storytelling, because it leaves the room for the audience to, like you said, put themselves right there. And what does that mean to them, right? They can see themselves in that story.
Yeah. The other example I always use is BMW when they came out with the ultimate driving machine.
Yeah. Yeah.
So think about those 4 words. Ultimate means you can't get any better than this. Yeah. Driving is something everybody does, and everybody wants the best thing that they can possibly drive. For some people, it means holding their family. For some people, it means going fast. Some people are going to be on a mountain road. And then that word machine brings into it this visualization of the pistons moving in the car. You're in action when you hear that phrase. So once again, it told a complete story in 4 words.
Yeah. And how much better than that, then it's a great car.
Yeah. So whenever I see marketing material come out, I usually go back to either, Jobs or BMW, and I go, okay, so how does this marketing stuff measure up?
Yeah, that's fabulous. So Mark, I know we're kind of coming up on our time here, and I wonder, is there anything I didn't ask you about, or is there anything that you would like to say, or maybe that you say about these things that you just haven't said yet?
One of the things that I come back to is an event that we did back in 2015, and it was on the U.S.-Mexico border.
Oh, boy. Yes, let's talk about that.
And we partnered with TEDx Tijuana, and this took 2.5 years to pull off. When you talk about how much effort goes into something, we had to get government approvals at city, state, and national levels. It was unbelievable. But what we did is we built one stage in the United States and one stage in Mexico. And the only thing separating those 2 stages was the border fence itself, which was right on the Pacific Ocean, San Diego and Tijuana.
Wow.
And we alternated our speakers, one in the U.S., one in Mexico, one in the U.S., one in Mexico, back and forth. And you could see through this fence, and we had speakers, so you could see the other speaker and you could hear the sound of the other person speaking.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, the first 2 speakers who got up to deliver their talks gave their talk. They only gave half of their talk on that stage. Then they walked off the stage, they got in their car, and they drove across the border. And they were the last 2 speakers of the day on the other stage, speaking the other language.
Wow.
And the whole point to that event was to really bring to light the fact that you can build fences, you can build walls, you can create laws, you can do anything you want, but you will never stop cultures from communicating with each other. You will never stop cultures from sharing their food, their art, their music, their conversations, their very lives. And that's what I want people to remember, is that especially in this digital age, and the fact that every TEDx talk ends up as a YouTube video, your talk can touch people all across the planet for decades to come.
Yeah.
Year after year, somebody Googling a certain topic might very well come up with your talk, and you can touch the life of somebody you've never met in a very profound way, which is why it's so important to get your talk right, to put the work into it, because you want that message to be global in nature.
Yeah.
And so understand that no matter what's going on at the political or the business level, events like TEDx events have this ability to connect cultures. And I think that is what's going to help the planet more than anything else.
Wow. What a great note to wrap this up on, Mark. And I think that that's something worth going back and replaying, to think about your TED talk, your any talk that's going to get recorded and put online, right? Like to put the effort into it, like that's the possibility affecting people all across the globe when they find it. Somebody you've never met could change their lives if you treat it like that when you're creating it, right? And you make it that good and that clear. So fabulous. So fabulous. Always great to get to spend time with you, Mark. And I do hope I get to come visit you in Lisbon while you're there. Real quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this. We got to go pretty soon, but what is your read on what's going to happen? Because we're recording this in November of 2021. I think TEDx events have basically fallen off the face of the earth. I think a lot of people tried to do them virtually at first, but I think one of the things about TED and TEDx events is that the whole point is being together in person, right? I mean, on some level, that's the whole point. And then, of course, there's this really nice artifact of a recorded talk that lives forever online. But the fun of those things and the reason people pour their heart and souls into them like that, 1,000 hours of work to do that event, and it's all volunteer. The reason is to get together in person. Are you hearing anything on the drums or the vines about what's happening in that world?
I am. And this is to some extent anecdotal because it's just based on my own experience here. Yeah. But over the years, I ended up signing up for a lot of newsletters from a lot of TEDx events.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
And I would constantly get notices, come to our event or nominate a speaker or whatever. Mm-hmm. And of course, when the pandemic hit and all the events got canceled, that volume of email went to close to zero. Then it came back a little bit with people announcing virtual events, and I've attended a few virtual events. It's very strange to see somebody on stage delivering a talk and there is no audience. So it was sad for me that these people didn't have that opportunity to feel the energy of the audience.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that just within the last 3 months, that volume is starting to increase, where people are saying, we have a date for our spring event. Get ready, buy your tickets now.
Yeah.
Places like, I think I just got an email from TEDx Berkeley, at the University of California, Berkeley in California. And I've been to that event a couple of times, and it's a wonderful event. It's student run. And so I was excited to see that they're going to have an event next year.
Yeah, great.
The problem is that a lot of people, once their event shut down, they might have gone off to do other things. And that's another point we hadn't talked about, is that nobody actually owns a license to a TEDx event.
Yeah.
You have to renew it every single year.
Yeah.
And if you decide not to do it, somebody else can take on that license.
Yeah.
So certain events have had multiple curators over the years. So I think it may take a couple of years for some of these events where the organizer went away for somebody else to come back in and pick it up.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is I'm seeing more emails, more events are happening. People can always go to TED.com, and there is a menu item for attending an event. And you can click on Attend TEDx, and it will show you a map of the entire world and all of the events that are coming up. And I'm seeing more activity there also. So I'm very happy to see the fact that more speakers are going to have an opportunity to share their beautiful wisdom on stage with the rest of the world.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you for all that you've done, all of the thousands of hours that you spent organizing TEDxSanDiego for 6 years, and all the events that you've worked on and the people that you've drawn out of whom you've drawn stories that make a difference. And I really thank you for being my friend, and I thank you for being in my life, and I thank you on behalf of just everybody for being the person you are and being in the world and making the difference you make. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. And I'm so happy we did this.
Well, as I said at the beginning, it's an honor to be here. The audience does need to know that from the influence standpoint, you influenced me first, because this goes back to 2012 when we first met, because you were putting on a speaker workshop in San Diego.
Uh-huh.
And so I got to sit in the audience and hear your wisdom about putting a talk together. So I want to turn that back around and say thank you for all of the effort that you've put in, not only in the TEDx world, but you've done so much coaching outside of that in the corporate world. And you have touched so many lives that I consider you not only a friend, but to be a hero of mine. So thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with your audience.
You're very welcome, Mark. You're very welcome. I'm getting a little teary-eyed thinking about it. Boy, that was lots has happened since then, and it's been wonderful. So, well, listen, that word love, I love you, Mark, and I'm so glad we got to spend this time. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Take care, John.
Take care.
Thank you for joining the Speak Like a Leader podcast. Go be awesome.